come into Three Sisters Springs, you could be 100 miles away from anything. You hear the birds and you hear the manatees. You'll hear them coming up for air. You'll hear just kind of the water rippling.
What Three Sisters Springs allows people to do then is really have a little window into what it's like in the day of a life of a manatee.
I remember a time when incoming Speaker of the House, Will Weatherford, I brought him here. There was a fog coming off the spring, and there were 400 manatee clustered up inside there. And I remember Will's comment to this day. He turned to me and he said, "Gene, this is almost religious. This is an unbelievable scene and feeling that this place gives me."
I think on a world stage, people come here from all over, from Europe and different countries.
I can remember once being in an airport in London where I mentioned to somebody that I come from Crystal River, Florida. And they turned to me and said, "That's where Three Sisters Springs is."
If you've ever been in Crystal River to Three Sisters during the dead of winter and you see these manatees stacked on top of each other to get warmth in order to survive, it's very hard not to say, we gotta do something about that.
There's a really great aerial photograph from 1944. And this photograph is really of the whole area, but you can see the Three Sisters Springs footprint, which was a small spring pool that was nestled in an area of what we call hydric hammock, which is kind of a fancy way of saying forested wetland, in the 1960s and early 70s. So that's when the area around Kings Bay really started to develop, and there were a lot of finger-filled canals that were dug. A man by the name of Harvey Goodman, who owned adjacent property, decided to buy this land actually as a gift for his wife, Linda, with the intended purpose of putting houses out here on this property.
Basically, it's a dredge and fill operation. The lake in the middle that was called Lake Linda, that was dredged out, and all that the soil from that was used as fill to create this 56-acre property.
So in the mid-1990s, Harvey Goodman decided he wanted to sell the property, and it was at that time that Ellie Schiller and others really started to band together to see if there was an option for this land to be purchased for conservation.
You know, Ellie was very adamant about this being on the top of her list. We were really afraid that this was going to be destroyed, and once it's done, it's done.
You know, in the beginning, we took it for granted. We took Three Sisters for granted. Then all of a sudden, word got out that a number of people had invested in the property and had the idea of developing a high-density condominium project on the land.
Originally, they were going to put over 400 dwellings there. And so you put 2 or 3 people in every dwelling. We're talking about up to 1,200 people maybe living on that little 56-acre plot of land all around the spring.
And they also had water rights. They could have theoretically pumped water out of these springs for some of the bottled water companies.
And then who would have had access to it? Well, the answer is nobody.
And when you started talking to people about the importance of the springs to manatee population, you saw the number of manatees that came here for protection in cold weather. It just seemed like a critical piece of property to save.
We were fortunate at the time. We had a guy named Andy Houston was our city manager.
I was pretty heavily involved.
And he got together with Lace Blue McLean.
I was president of the Friends of the Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge.
Between the two of them, between the leadership of that pair, came a plan to try to rescue Three Sisters.
So the asking price came in at $13.5 million. So you go, oh my gosh, how are we going to raise all this kind of money?
The owners, rightfully so, they're real estate investors, right? They were going to develop that to make a profit.
Most of them owned car ownerships, selling Fords, Buicks, whatever.
They were hard-faced, serious men who needed to be persuaded that this was the right course of action.
Part of the game changer was one day we were standing out here at the head of Three Sisters. Jim Krause, the refuge manager at the time, Hal Flowers, one of the owners, And we're standing there and we're looking at the manatees swimming in and out. The next thing we know, there was a manatee that had gone by. It looked like it was stressful. Next thing you know, Hal and David are in the water, helping that manatee to maneuver itself around. And later Hal tells that that was a game changer for him. That was significant for him to understand that this property really needed to be maintained for the manatees.
I think Hal was a developer who turned into an environmentalist, and specifically when he saw this property, had the same feeling that many of us who live here now do, that it needs to be preserved.
So they wanted to at least break even, and I think they originally paid $10.5 million for the property, and eventually they took $10.5 million for the property.
So the acquisition of this property and ultimately the protection of this property from development was a very complicated road.
Around the table, we had U.S. government, state government, county government, and Crystal River and Inverness, and then private individuals as well.
The price tag was a little over $10 million, and that's a big project for a group, community this size to take on.
But in the beginning, the very cool thing was that it was a bunch of $10 and $25 contributions. People just started writing checks and putting money in buckets and saying, we're gonna contribute to this.
Florida Communities Trust had been identified by the City of Crystal River as kind of the main agent to come through with funding and to coordinate the project.
And we had, we had our setbacks, but again, because we had so many people around that table, we encouraged each other. We just kept plugging, and we just kept plugging, and we just kept plugging.
Wonderful coalition of state, private, city, county agencies, and private citizens all coming together to raise that much money.
Goethe once said, be bold and mighty forces shall come to your aid. And I think mighty forces came together to make this one happen.
I grew up in Kansas. In Kansas, we don't have manatees, but we do have people who are interested in preserving the wildlife that is native where they are.